Thank you for joining us today. Anne Ricketts, founder of Lighthouse Communications, where I also teach and coach. Super grateful to be working with such an awesome team. And you founded Lighthouse in 2013, so it's been 10 years, is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been 10 years.
Yeah. When you got the first gig for Lighthouse, I mean, did you have kind of a vision for the company, or you're just like, let's just try this and see what happens?
It was more the latter. It's kind of a blur because, as you probably know, Rebecca, when you're starting something new, I mean, there was just so much energy and motivation around it. But I'll tell you, when I got my first client, I didn't have Lighthouse Communications yet. It was just Anne Ricketts, and Facebook was my first client. And I was going in, I had a regular full-time job, and I was going in the evening teaching workshops for non-native English speakers.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was right place, right time. And that learning and development department there said, we have a presentation skills workshop. It's too corporate, whatever that means. Do you have something? And it was this moment where my first thought was, no, I can't build this course by myself. This is too much pressure. And then, I was in my early 30s and I was single and didn't have kids. And I just thought, well, why not? And so I got a lot of help from family and friends because I didn't have a lot of business experience. I'd always been in higher ed. But it was just kind of saying yes to the experience. I did it a few times. It worked well, and it kind of picked up around, and I was going all around the country to their different offices. And then about a year of doing that on the side, I said, okay, let's start this.
That's amazing that Facebook was your first client. I mean, what a ringer, right? That's great.
I know.
Yeah, so good that you accepted the challenge like that. I think a lot of people would have backed down. That's super intimidating. Yeah.
Yeah, what's funny is I was reading Sheryl Sandberg's book Lean In, which I know is controversial now, but there was this chapter saying basically that what would you do if you weren't afraid? And that she sees lots of women turn down career opportunities for future, family and obligations they have. And it kind of struck a chord with me. And I thought, yeah, if I don't like it, I don't have to be doing it. But the worst case scenario is it doesn't go well and I go back to my regular gig. So
yeah, that's great. And so you have a BA in Italian. I'm curious, why Italian, or were you just in love with the language?
Kind of like Lighthouse Communications, I stumbled into it. Initially, I wanted to be a physical therapist, a track coach. I was very into athletics growing up. And then sort of as one identity as an athlete in college, I decided I was always injured, and I decided I'm not going to run competitively anymore. And that was very much my identity. And so I'm kind of thinking at 21 years old, who am I? What do I do? And I threw myself into learning Italian and this idea of going abroad. And then it was very much, then I find myself in Italy, and I'm getting to, like, nobody knows Anne Ricketts, the runner. And so I'm totally getting to reinvent myself. And I just loved it. I just had a blast there. And by that time by the time I came back to UC Davis for my senior year, I had all these credits, and I thought, why not major in what I'm passionate about? And then promptly after I graduated, I went back.
That's so cool. Where were you in Italy?
I was in a couple different places. I started off in Siena, and then I was supposed to spend a whole school year in Florence, but then no one was speaking Italian in Florence. There were so many Americans. So I went to Perugia, this town that's famous for Amanda Knox.
Oh, right. Oh my gosh. Right. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. And how do you think living abroad has made you a better communicator?
I think, made me a better communicator in the sense that you have to be courageous to learn a language. And I see this now with my 2-year-old. So you just have to try, and you have to start somewhere. You probably know this from being in Portugal right now. And yes, the pronunciation might not be right. And yes, people might laugh because you make a mistake, but it just kind of taught me the only way I'm going to get better is to try and get out there. And I think so much of communication if I think back on starting my business, probably the first workshop I taught 10 years ago, if there were a camera in the room, I'd probably cringe, but I had to start somewhere. And so you just go and you get better.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, essentially that's confidence, right? It's like just trying the thing and doing it and then getting a little more confidence. It's like putting coins in a piggy bank or something like that. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Have you always been confident with your communication skills, or is it something that you've had to work at?
As a kid, I was super shy. I remember that was always a topic in the parent teacher conferences of like Anne not having confidence and a lot of apologizing and needing to, at faking I was sick because I didn't want to go to school. And actually it was athletics. I think that maybe around fourth or fifth grade that I discovered that I was a good athlete. And I think having something to channel my energy fueled my confidence. And I don't know that in particular that I was a confident communicator. I think so much, as I mentioned before, my identity was around athletics. But as soon as, I kind of switched gears and I was like, okay, I'm a language person or I'm a teacher now, then I sort of built my confidence over time. But I mean, I certainly remember even when we worked at Academy of Art, I remember speaking up at a staff meeting and getting red and blotchy. And I was, anytime I had to do public speaking in the moment, I was going in, I was like, oh yeah, I'm fine. But in the moment, I sort of had this out of body experience where I didn't feel very in control in the moment. I felt like I was speaking very fast and I was very red and very uncomfortable. So it's definitely something that I still have to work through.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was listening to a podcast you did recently, and you said that you struggle with getting nervous. I don't know if that's still true for you, but do you have like some hacks that you have for yourself for when you feel nervous? What do you do?
Well, let's see. I think over time I've had to gain perspective on it. And I think that helps me to just realize like this presentation or this interview, it's not my whole life doesn't depend on this. And so just putting into perspective beforehand and sometimes after, because I don't struggle so much before, but sometimes in the moment, if it's not going as well, let's say I'm teaching a workshop and the audience is quiet. Sometimes I can go into a negative story that I think many of us do in the moment of like, oh, I'm not good, or oh, I'm blowing it.
Yeah.
And then certainly after I have a hard time letting it go. So I've had to, one hack that I have to let it go is the 24-hour rule. So I have 24 hours to talk about it with my family, think about it, and then I'm going to put it to the side and move forward.
Okay. And what about in the moment? What do you do in the moment if you start down that negative story route?
I have a mantra that I tell myself that is no bad stories. So for example, let's say someone's distracted on their phone, instead of going to the dark side and thinking, oh, they're on their phone because I suck. It's, hey, they've got something they're dealing with. It has nothing to do with me. When they're ready to come back, they'll come back. And so I just try to focus on the people who are giving me eye contact, and then maybe I have a chance to check in with that person later. Now, all that's much easier in person than it is virtual.
Yeah.
So that's my no bad stories, my mantra.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and the whole virtual and in-person thing is something that, that's been a big shift over the last 3 years for all of us, not just people in our line of work. But I'm curious, how have you seen communication skills, like the struggle that people have with communication skills, change over the last 3 years? What have you noticed, and how are you maybe pivoting your content and the way you work with people to address those issues?
That's interesting, because I don't know that what they need is necessarily different, but I feel that, and I don't know if you struggle with this, but that people want things faster. They want they want more in less time. And I just don't
Mhm.
think that it works that way. So I have to have a lot of conversations with clients
Mhm.
of, you know, we can do one topic in 90 minutes, but not four. And so
Well, I love what you were saying about like, essentially everybody wants a silver bullet. Everybody's moving so fast. And it's one thing I've noticed too. And, you know, it's like doing an online workshop. There's a lot to be said for what people can get out of an online workshop, but I think at the end of the day, people are just really struggling with loneliness, honestly, like being on the screen all day and like staring into a camera, and you know, like it is hard out there. And I think employers are, I think they're looking to us and the products and services that we offer to kind of like alleviate some of this stress that's going on. Like maybe they're not saying it directly, but I think that that's part of what they're looking for. And I think it's like a cultural shift that is, it's really hard to address right now. And I think it's impacting people in a lot of really interesting and profound ways. And I don't think we're going to know what that even looks
well
like for a
said, yeah.
while.
And how
Yeah.
do you know in a Zoom, let's say you're presenting and you see all these rectangles, like how do you even know what's going on with people and what they're thinking? That was definitely hard for me. I mean, I would say 6 months to a year, I
Mhm.
really struggled to adjust presenting
Mhm.
virtually. And what helped me, and in turn, what I usually teach is like the North Star of the one thing. If there's one thing you want to focus
Mhm.
on
Mm.
in your communication, it is prioritizing connection.
Connection, yeah.
Because it's so easy to say, like, just yesterday, I was helping some presenters who were going to do a tech all hands, and they had all these points they have to hit. And it's just
Yeah.
like, lose 10 of those and
Yeah,
just look at the camera and what's your one point that you want to say and what's the
exactly.
one story that you could tell,
Yeah.
just really simplifying. And I think that's when it finally, a year later,
Yeah.
I started to feel more comfortable when I ditched my script and was just like, okay,
Mhm.
let me
Mm.
convey
Mm.
one simple point. Let me look around the room. Let me make space.
Mhm.
What's happening? So,
Mhm.
less is more, because that will allow
Yeah.
you to notice what's happening and
Yeah.
connect.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you reminded me. So I went to what's it called? A conference in Vienna last weekend, and it was for this organization called Female Founders, and they're a female entrepreneurship fund. And so there are like pitches that happen and all the stuff. And I met one of the women who was pitching later at a bar at one of these events. And I said, hey, you know, you had a great pitch. And she's like, oh, I don't think it was great. And so we started
Mm.
talking about it. And she said, well, if you could give me one piece of advice, what would it be? And I said, you know, like it's not popular, and I know you're probably not going to do it because nobody else is going to do it, but I would tell you to take all the words off your slides. And she said, I wanted to do that, but they told me
Mm.
not to. And I said, yeah, it's the culture. The culture tells you like, make them drink from a fire hose. Like you got to get it all in.
Right.
And I've also worked with so many companies, and I always say, yeah, you got to connect first. And they're like, we don't have time for that. And I'm just like, well, what's the point then? Like your
What's the
message
point?
isn't
Yeah.
going to land, you know? So yeah,
Yeah. It
big
kind of goes
struggle.
back to that idea, what you were saying of like, to be a really strong communicator, it does take a little bit of courage. Because I always say to my client, just because everyone else is doing like having slides with a bunch of words, or just because everyone else is starting off a presentation by talking about themselves,
Yeah.
doesn't mean that you should, doesn't
Yeah.
mean that you have to. And yeah, it will feel weird the first time you have slides without words, or you jump right into a presentation, the first words out of your mouth or a story, but people will notice. And over time, it's going to feel more comfortable for you. But I think that it's made me think of another idea. One of the kind of tension points that I hit, especially lately, maybe with younger folks, is this idea of being comfortable
Mhm.
and being effective. And
Mhm.
is it bad if it's not comfortable for me? Is
Mhm.
that bad? Does that mean it's not authentic? Do you know what I'm saying?
What is the it you're talking about if it's not comfortable?
So for example, let's say that we were working on your delivery
Mhm.
and you're going to be more intentional about pausing and gesturing.
Mhm.
I- If that feels uncomfortable at first, if that doesn't feel natural, does that mean that that's not authentic, that you're being
Mm.
inauthentic by communicating in that way? And I, as a communication coach, I think, no, it's just anytime you do something new, it's gonna feel strange, but it's really about your audience. And is it going to help your audience connect to you? Is it going to help your audience understand your message? If the answer is yes, then try it. But
Right.
I think for a lot of people that doesn't feel authentic or comfortable. And so there's a lot of conversations around that at the moment.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And that brings me back to foreign language learning because it's all about your audience at the beginning,
Mhm.
like if you're not paying attention to, um, am I using the right form of the verb? And therefore, will they or will they not understand me? Like your audience is the highlight here, the spotlight I'm trying to say.
Right.
And like that's how we grow up communicating because we want stuff from our parents, and like get
Yeah.
their attention, whatever. And then somehow, somewhere, it changes over time. And then we get more focused on ourselves and we get self-conscious and we get nervous and all the things, and we forget about the audience that we're meant to be talking to.
Mhm.
And I think it's interesting, the whole conversation around comfortable versus authenticity,
Mhm.
because if you're communicating something so that your audience understands you, I mean, isn't that authentic? Because that's a desire that you have, but you're only like putting on an accent or whatever so that your audience will understand you, which is your goal, which is
Right.
authentic. So I don't know, it's kind of a roundabout way of going about it, but yeah, it's an interesting conversation for sure.
It's certainly complicated. I mean, I think part of it is that it feels uncomfortable. So it's easier
Mhm.
to just say, oh, that doesn't feel authentic to me, or that's not me.
Yeah.
But I think that your personality comes later. It's like in a language. I remember,
Yeah.
when I first started speaking Italian, I first got there and whoa, everyone's speaking so fast. And I'm sure my personality wasn't coming through because I was just getting the basics out. But
Right.
then once you get more fluency and you get more comfortable,
Mhm.
then you can kind of, people start to understand your personality, and then you're speaking a foreign language and it feels more like your authentic personality. But
Yeah.
that takes time, I think.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. It does take time. I always tell people, like when I'm teaching the prep structure, I always teach them, yes, it's going to feel like speaking Greek or feel like a
Mm,
foreign language at first, but after a while, you'll just get fluency with it and then it'll be natural to you. So
right.
yeah. I was just thinking when you were saying that, how communication skills it's known as a soft skill, right? And communication skills also comes up as often one of the top 3 skills that you need to rise to your potential in your career. And working with a lot of tech companies as we do, I'm curious if you've noticed the focus on soft skills change over time, over the years, over the last 10 years.
That's interesting. Once in a while, I hear a company say soft skills, but I think I, I don't know exactly because I don't know how they talk about it at every company internally. But that's it's rare that I hear that anymore. So I hope that they're
Mm.
seeing it as like a really, really essential skill. And I know that there's kind of a theme emerging that some of our clients who are hiring younger and younger people, new grads, or they call them emerging talent, there's a
Mhm.
heavy focus on getting them the communication skills. And I think one of the trends that we're seeing right now are some of the folks that were in college during the pandemic, maybe they missed out on internships, where
Oh,
they were
right.
learning how to be in a business meeting and navigate professional communication, and they missed out on some of that. So some of those people that are graduating now are really needing a little bit of help.
Yeah. And are you offering, have you developed any content for that group in particular so far?
Yeah, Michael and I have worked on some content around meetings and how to be, not just wait for your boss to ask you for information, but how can you bring it up proactively? Like, for example, how do you give a status update, or how can you ask for help or for advice? Because I think sometimes, anybody, not necessarily new grads, but it could be anyone in their career, they feel like maybe they should have all the answers and they should know it. And that by
Yeah.
asking their boss, like, hey, what do you think about this? Or have you encountered this before? What would you do if you were me? That's showing weakness, but actually research shows that it makes you look smarter because you're asking for their advice. So
Yeah.
people like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my God. 100%. I coach a lot of women, and one of the questions I get the most is,
Mm,
what do I say if I don't know the answer? And I'm like, you just say like, well, I don't know the answer. And like, what I do know is this. And like, do
right.
you know the answer, or who knows the answer? I think it says a lot about culture that we think that we have to put on this show to, be someone we're not, or know more than we do, so that, I don't know, we're not fired or whatever we think the repercussions of that are going to be.
Right.
And yeah, there's such a struggle around that, especially for young people.
And if you
Yeah.
think about it now, it really ties back to authenticity of, if you have the confidence to say, I'm needing some help with this, or actually don't know, but here's what I do know, so having those, a lot of what we're doing is teaching those phrases, like kind of back when we taught English as a second language, you have these phrases. And I really like those because I think if you have that to get you started, then you can kind of go from there. But sometimes in the moment, I certainly know this as someone who gets nervous in the moment, I freeze, and sometimes I just can't think. But if I
Yep.
have these phrases for these different situations, it helps me move forward. And then I can think once I get going.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember when I was in my English as a second language training, they taught us like chunking, you would chunk it down for the students and teach them these chunks of phrases that they could then add onto like Legos. And yeah, it's super helpful for people. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, let me look at these other questions here for a second. Yeah, I'm curious, has there been a time in your career that you like tell me a story of like, oh man, I should have done it differently, or like when there was a time that you're like, damn it, like I really took the wrong approach, or I don't know, like, is there a story that pops in your mind?
Oh, I know that storytelling is best when it's one specific event, but I feel like, well, there's one presentation that comes to mind in my mind. Is just like, oh, that didn't go well. And it was an offsite for lawyers. And in retrospect, I should have known going in, like, oh, 80 lawyers at an
Oh,
offsite where they've been presented to all day and they didn't opt into this training. That's a tough audience. But
yeah.
again, I kind of was like, oh, I was teaching persuasion. It was this class I had done many times, and I felt good going in. I prepped, I practiced, I'd done all the things that were in my control. And it just wasn't a friendly vibe. I mean, even the way that we were introduced was, all right, pay attention. You got to pay attention.
Oh
And it
God.
wasn't like, here's what's in it for you, or here's why we asked this speaker and this audience. And they weren't, I was trying, I was asking them questions. They were giving me nothing. They weren't asking questions. And it was terrible. And it took me weeks to get over it because it was just like, I don't know. And so it's really, I'd love to get your thoughts on it. Like, I think I could have been better prepared, of really audience analysis of like, Gonna
Mm.
be tough, and here's my backup plan if they're tough. And I didn't have that going in. I just thought, oh, it's going to be great. And so I think audience analysis is really important. But I also think in a way that was where I came up with the 24-hour rule of like, hey, I got to move on. Yes, I could have done things differently, and maybe it just wasn't, the audience wasn't that into it, and a lot of that was out of my control. And
Yeah.
it doesn't mean that I'm terrible. It just means that it wasn't, my day. And let's carry on and move on. And I have to shake that out of my system.
Yeah.
Have you ever
Thank
had
you
something
for
like that?
sharing. Oh,
Yeah.
I mean, sure. Yeah. I'm trying to think, like, I'm sure that I have like 10 stories like that. One's not coming to mind right now, but I love the phrase audience analysis. And I think I usually say audience research or something, like you've got to research your audience. That's one of the hacks I teach about how to be more confident, is actually get to know your audience before they know you, essentially. And I do
Mhm.
all kinds of stuff, like even before calls, if I'm meeting someone for the first time on a Zoom call, I'll go on their LinkedIn, and even just seeing their photo somehow, like, it makes me calm down. I read a little about them. Maybe I learn something about them, and I say, oh, I saw that you lived in Toronto, or whatever. And that's really helpful. And then with, of course, larger audiences, that's harder, but you can really, a thing that's super helpful for me is getting intimately in touch with the problem that they're trying to solve, or like trying to get in that mindset of why do they need this? And then putting that into the first 5 minutes of my content. Like, why is this important? I remember I taught this workshop I did a Google, like a workshop for their sales team or something. And I was really intimidated because it was this global team. I was like, oh my God, it's the biggest thing I've ever done. And I interviewed a couple people who were at Google, like friends of friends, and just so familiarized myself with that culture a bit. And then I just got really clear, like, well, why do they need this? And then I made that front and center at the beginning, like, here's why you need this. And somehow that helped me calm down, because I was more emotionally invested in their success than my performance.
Yeah, that always helps me with that mindset.
Mhm.
I think as I'm thinking about it now, I think that probably my misstep was thinking, oh, I know this company well. I've done
Yeah.
this workshop a lot at this company. It's a hit. But within a company, there's so many micro audiences, like lawyers would be their own thing. And having an offsite where everyone's, and if somebody doesn't opt into it is its own thing.
Uh,
And so I like your tip of like having you might be thinking this, well, here's something I've thought
yeah.
about that, of just
Yeah.
addressing that head on and
Yeah.
having backup plans for sure just helps you not be so shocked in the moment when
Yeah.
when things are playing out. And of course you don't always know, but it sure helps to really think about the mindset. What's their
Mhm.
mindset likely to be on this day? Are they going to be skeptical? Are they going to be energetic? And now I ask the organizer, I say, what's likely, what's their mindset? What's
Mhm.
the vibe of the day? Where am
Mhm.
I in the lineup?
Totally.
Am I before
Yeah.
lunch, after lunch? Really trying to think about all those small things helps.
Yeah. Yeah. I did a workshop recently. It was an offsite in Atlanta, and I was like
Oh, yeah.
middle of the day, and they had just eaten lunch, and I was like, okay, this is going to be tough. And so I put them in a big circle, and we had this kind of like crazy song, and we did warm-up exercises, and it was the funnest thing I've done all year. It was like 50 people, we were like dancing around, and we had such a good time, and it really set the tone and got everybody to laugh a little bit. And
Fun,
yeah, so it's nice to know where you are in the lineup.
for
Super important.
sure.
Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
after lunch is tough.
Oh God. Yeah, it's really tough.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
how did you dance? What song did you play? I'm curious.
So I love when I'm teaching workshops, and you do this too. Songs without lyrics are great because they're not distracting so much as
Mm.
setting a tone. And I can't remember. I can send it to you later, but it was kind of like dun 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 dun, and
Mm.
so crazy because I listened to it so many times in the hotel room before that morning session that I couldn't go to sleep that night because the
Because you were
song
thinking
was
of it.
just
That's
going
funny.
in my mind because it was so catchy,
Yeah,
Uh, yeah, so that
that's
was
fun.
it's fun.
We
Yeah.
do. It reminds me of something in our workshop, the full day presentation skills workshop, that was really mostly what we did before the pandemic. And now we're starting to do it again. We do vocal exercises, and we have them say this funny phrase, mamalo papalo. It sounds very Italian, and people love it. And then afterwards, when I email with them, they'll sign it, mamalo papalo, and really
Yeah.
stick with them. And it's just like getting on their feet and having everyone do this thing that feels a little bit silly, but there is some learning in it.
Yeah, for sure. And that reminds me of, so what we're talking about is getting people to just like loosen up, essentially, like
Mhm.
just relax. And so much of what I see and talk about with clients and people in general about presenting is that everybody talks about presenting as if it's a performance. Like I
Right.
did a talk for Toastmasters the other day here in Lisbon, and I saw the post that Joao, the head of the organization, wrote on LinkedIn, and he's like, "Come see two master storytellers perform." And I was like,
Mm.
"What? But it's not really a performance." I kind of bristled at that a bit, but I'm curious. I'm curious your thoughts about that, about people seeing presentations as performances, how that affects their performance. Obviously there are two meanings of that
Right.
word. Yeah, what have you noticed?
Ooh, I think it's I mean, it's everything. It's certainly, to me, I had a sticky note in the pandemic when I was really struggling that said, it's not a performance, it's
Mhm.
a conversation. And
Yeah.
yes, you may be doing the majority of the speaking, but if you can change your mindset to think about it as a conversation,
Mhm.
everything opens up. It's like,
Mhm.
number one, I think people can easily fall into a presenter voice where, talk about inauthentic, it might not even sound like them. It's like really serious, and you look serious, and that's not engaging. And if you feel like it's a conversation and you're talking to your friend, your voice is going to have more energy, you're going to use your
Yeah.
hands more. And then I think most importantly, you're making space for the audience to speak. So
Mhm.
sometimes in my coaching, I'll notice people will ask the audience a question, and I'll say, "Did you want us to respond?" And they'll go, "Yeah." I'm like, "Okay, well, we need to pause and tell us
Yeah.
what you're noticing. Maybe call in somebody. Oh, I saw you raise your hand. Tell me more." And so I think once you get that into your mindset that it's not a performance, it's a conversation, everything opens up.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's
And it's
so
true.
important.
I found that really helpful too for doing social media videos as
Mm,
well. I used to get so freaked out because, I have my camera and I'm doing my thing and I'm like, oh my God, like, I mean, it's not like I have a big audience or anything, but I was like, there are many people watching me or watching this video, and I would
stressful, yeah.
lose my mind. And then I can't remember who told me, they said, well, just imagine you're talking to one person. And I thought, oh, that's easy. And like I could put that person in my head and talk to them. And then all of a sudden everything changed. It was so much more authentic. And it was fun for me then because, like you said, it's this conversation, even if you're not getting the feedback from them in real time. So yeah, speaking to one
Absolutely.
person, it's really helpful.
And you know what's counterintuitive about that is I think that it takes a few reps of practice to get to that place. I mean, like
Yeah.
anytime, for example, this is a script that I have for a class I'm teaching tomorrow. And my process is I will type out everything I'm going to say and I'll
Mhm.
print it out. And at first, when I'm first saying it, it sounds very robotic. But then once I know it enough, I put it away and then I just talk to it. And it's the
Mhm.
whole goal is pretending like I'm telling a friend. So the language is less formal.
Yeah.
But the first time I say it, it's not going to be conversational. And I think a lot of people steer away from practicing because they don't want to be robotic.
Mhm.
But you can only become conversational after
Right.
you do it a few times. You have to really internalize that content first.
Yeah, it's so true. One of my favorite quotes is by the actor Donald Pleasance. And he was back in the 70s. I don't remember what show he was in, but he said, all the real work gets done in rehearsal. And I love that quote because it's so true. It's like what you're saying. I have the same process. I winnow down my script. I'll write it all out. I have my slides, and then I'll just go through this editing process. I'm like, what can I take away? What can I take away? And then I'm usually left with one like pithy statement. And it's funny, I did a workshop recently, and I had my assistant there, and she had my script. Like, I wasn't looking at it, it was in person. And after the workshop, she said, oh, it was really interesting because sometimes you would lead with the point and then you would elaborate and give examples and tell stories. And then sometimes you would elaborate, give examples, tell stories, and then you would end with the punchline of the point. And she's like, both were really effective. But it was very alive because you knew it wasn't memorized, but you always got that point in there. And that's what you're speaking to as well, is this, like, you can't, you have to rehearse being natural, like, essentially.
Right, you do. I know. I mean, my neighbors probably think I'm crazy because I love walking and rehearsing, because I don't know, something about being outside, it all kind of clicks for me. I mean, I do think it's important to practice with slides, but I just like being outside and moving. And my neighbors see me and they kind of laugh. Oh, you've got a presentation coming up. I'm like, I do. I do. But it's funny for me too, because it's not just about the delivery, but then I make connections where I'm like, oh, that's what that means. Or, oh, it's actually that. And so, and that deeper understanding of my content only comes after several, practice rounds.
For sure. Yeah. And I saw on your LinkedIn profile, you've coached people for TED, like TEDx talks, or what's your experience with that?
Yeah, several speakers who were getting ready for TED Talks. I helped prep for in South by Southwest. And I think that those situations or in keynotes, they're a little more script heavy. I mean, they don't have to be, but I think that there's check-ins and various things. And so for those, the preparation is really, really key and would be more time consuming than other presentations for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And is your general advice to go ahead and memorize something like that?
Yeah, I think it would. Yes, I think I would really know what I want to say and memorize it. But hopefully you're done with the content at least several days before. And then at that point, you can deviate a little bit. It doesn't have to be every word line by line, because I think the trouble that happens is if people memorize and they skip a line, they freak out.
They freeze.
And so always with the idea of the script is your loose guide, but you have to be willing to free flow and deviate a little bit. Cause I had a really bad experience with memorizing something one time. It was a storytelling event. I don't know, probably 2015, 2016. I was very into going to storytelling shows. And a couple of times I went up there, and you're not allowed in these shows to have a script. And this particular show was 10-minute story. So it's a lot of content. And I think there's one thing I kept telling myself, what if I forget? What if I forget? What if I forget? So I'm running this negative story. And so I get up there, and by the way, it's hundreds of people. I invited a bunch of my friends and family, and I get up there, I get a minute into my story, and I just blanked out, couldn't remember a word. And I was freaking out because I just thought, I don't know what to do. And so I said to the audience, I said, I can't remember my story. And they were like, oh, it's okay. And as soon as the silence was broken and they were talking to me, I remembered. And afterwards, I was so mad. I was so mad that I messed up. And I told my friend, oh, I blew it. And she goes, it's really good. Because back to our earlier point, I had presenter voice, and I was very focused on the content, and it wasn't conversational. But as soon as I got some feedback from the audience, I remembered again, I was much more conversational, and it was fine.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, and I have a story very similar to that. And I tell this story often at the beginning of presentation skills trainings. I was teaching I wasn't teaching, I was giving a talk for International Women's Day in downtown San Francisco. And I was so excited, like, oh my God, I love this audience. I love this topic. I love everything about this. And so I rehearsed for weeks and bought a new jacket, and like I was ready to go. And then I got on the stage and I got to line 3 and I just like totally blanked out. I don't know, like I lost it and I had to start over 3 times. It was so humiliating.
Mm.
But yeah, and the connect the dots that I tell around that story is like, yeah, I was too focused on myself, like my performance and how do I look and all the
Right.
things. And
Right.
I didn't take the time to connect with the audience. I just went up there kind of robotic and started talking. And then like that freaked me out. So yeah, connection is key for sure.
Yeah, it's totally the same thing that happened. And I think I could have, to your point of, there's, as a presentation skills coach, I really believe in starting strong, but I think there was too much pressure on the first word out of my mouth is the story. I could have gone up and said like, hey, how was everybody? I could have kind of
Right.
calmed down, settled myself a little bit
Yes.
before got oriented up there, because it's kind of disorienting when you go up on stage and your mic and is it right? And it's okay to take a moment. It's okay. Again, it's a conversation, not a performance. So I think that sometimes the advice of, first word has maybe not. And so you always have to take these bits of advice with a grain of salt and find out what's right for you.
Yeah, for sure. Great. I'm going to ask you one more question and then let you
Sure.
go because we've been talking for a while. So when you think of a confident person, like someone who communicates with confidence, what's the first thing that comes up for you? Like what do you notice and say, wow, that person's a confident communicator?
I think 2 things that really stick out for me. Number 1 is that they just say it. For example, it might not be fully thought out. It might not be the perfect thing, but maybe they say, you know what, the first thing that comes to mind, or, here are my first thoughts on this. And and they can indicate where they're at. It's not like the perfect thing, but here's their initial reaction.
Hmm.
And they just come forward with that. And the second thing, I am always impressed when people use structure. For
Mhm.
example, they say, 3 things come to mind right in the moment, and they're able to 1, 2, 3. And it's so easy to follow. And it always gives me the impression of like, wow, confident, concise. And the cool thing is it's so easy to use structure. So that's something that I'm a big fan of. And I always teach a structure.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Anne. Thanks so much. This was a really fun
Yeah, it was
conversation.
fun.
Yeah.